North Korea in 2026, Intentions, Realities, and Response. These topics and more today on The Impossible State.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become one of the United States' top national security priorities. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Welcome to the faithful viewers of The Impossible State. I'm Sid Seiler, a senior advisor here at the CSIS Korea Chair. I have today with us some special guests, some of the leading analysts on North Korea, certainly in the Washington, D.C. area, and longtime friends and partners in tackling these difficult issues. I have to my immediate left Rachel Minyoung Lee, who is a senior fellow with the Korea program in 38 North at the Stimson Center. Patrick Cronin, Dr. Cronin, is from the Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. And of course, Markus Garlauskas, the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. So thank you all for joining today. We originally had teed this up as a kind of a look at what we anticipated to be some type of New Year's speech or readout from a Ninth Party Congress, which did not take place, but perhaps that becomes a story as much as whether we had that or not, and there's more than enough to talk about. And I'd like to break this up into kind of looking at the North Korea threat, looking at trends and how the United States is responding to that, and then implications for South Korea and the alliance going forward. And I think that'll allow us all to play to our strengths and look at some of the more challenging issues. Rachel, we're sitting here waiting for the Ninth Party Congress as if it's going to give us some insights into North Korea that have long been hidden. Based on what you expect to see in the Ninth Party Congress and what you've seen overall as you watch on a regular basis North Korea's public pronouncements, either its formal authoritative statements or its day-to-day propaganda messaging, where do you think Kim Jong-un is today? Do you think he's rested and ready finally to engage Washington and Seoul? Is he finding comfort in his new relationship with Russia and China and just willing to make us wait? Is he biding time, or is he just simply enjoying the natural evolution of a movement towards recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state and winging it as he goes? Where do you think we are right now with North Korea and its expectations for the new year?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us here, Sid. And those are all really great questions. I wish I had something like rosy, like nice things to say, about North Korea, the prospects and all. But I think from Kim Jong-un's point of view, and this certainly has been the narrative that we have seen in North Korean media at the very authoritative levels and way to the bottom, the less authoritative, that the world is a very dangerous place. Northeast Asia is a very dangerous place, and the security risks for North Korea are increasing and that they are growing by the day. That has been the narrative, and I don't think that narrative is going to change going into the Ninth Party Congress and during and following the Ninth Party Congress. So I think that is the narrative that we will see. I think certainly from Kim Jong-un's point of view, he's keeping his eye on how the world is evolving, right? The geopolitics, how the regional, order may be changing. Certainly, I think he has taken note of the Trump administration's increasing tendency to get involved overseas. I think he has taken note of the U.S. bombings in Iran, the recent raid in Venezuela. I don't think those are new revelations per se for Kim Jong-un, anything like earth-shattering, but I do think that those are additional data points for him as he charts the next 5 years, on the foreign policy and defense policy front as well. So it would be interesting to see, I think from my point of view, during the party congress, as he gives his report, which should last about 2 or 3 days based on precedent, how he sort of, I guess, explains or describes the current global order. We have seen him using terminology in the past, like the new Cold War or the unipolar world that has quickly changed to a multipolar world. So we have seen those types of formulations. So it would be interesting to see how he characterizes the global order that he sees as of today. So maybe bringing us back to the Northeast Asia region then, I think on the U.S. part, we will continue to see a hardline stance, in my opinion, from Pyongyang, based on everything that Kim Jong-un has said very consistently. He has consistently talked about ramping up nuclear production, nuclear development. Of course, we know that North Korea has codified into the constitution continued nuclear development, right? So that's the starting point. And then, of course, so again, continued nuclear development production. He has also talked about just 2 days ago the next stage of bolstering the nuclear deterrence. Of course, back in September, just after he's come back from China, he talked about unveiling at the Ninth Party Congress a new Pyongyang policy, not Pyongyang line, which I thought was an interesting distinction. Pyongyang policy of developing conventional and nuclear weapons. So I think that's the trend that we will continue to see. However, so that's the stance on the U.S. On the Trump administration, though, I do think that Kim Jong-un will continue to explore, or not explore per se, maybe not proactively, but leaving the door ajar, right? Leaving the door open for an opportunity for resuming talks with the U.S. if it can do so on its own terms. And for South Korea, I don't foresee in the near future any reconciliation despite the efforts by the Lee administration.
So that's a very broad-ranging answer. What I take away is there's elements of the transformation in the international order that are comforting to Kim in that they provide a lifeline, his relationship with Russia. They provide an alternative to the U.S.-led liberal world order with all of its rules, all of its sanctions, all of its pressure, and that there is a survival road now in a evolving world order. At the same time, the uncertainties in how that world order evolves are troubling and concerning to Kim, and something he has to take into account. It's always interesting because, we spent a career looking at the U.S. isn't really a direct threat to North Korea, where they're keeping peace on the peninsula, administering the armistice, making sure peace and prosperity marks Northeast Asia. What is Kim so worried about? And yet, it's clearly anytime there's this type of change globally, it's going to make Kim concerned about his vulnerabilities. Is that, Markus, I'd like you to comment on that based on your own understanding. And in particular, is the threat growing from North Korea? I shared with you that interview that then President Biden had back in June 2024, where he said that the situation was not getting more threatening. It's equally as threatening as before. And with now progress in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and I think he would have added on to this other multilateral efforts, we were sufficiently countering the growth of the North Korean nuclear program. Are you worried about the growth of the program? Are you worried about the direction that we might see Kim head in 2026?
Absolutely. I'm not sure about 2026 specifically. It's sort of a artificial timeline, right? But certainly I'm concerned about the next few years. And I think part of it is because of the level of complacency that we have. And so you may recall we wrote a piece that when I first came out of government, my first major publication with the Atlantic Council was titled "Deterrence is Crumbling in Korea, How We Can Fix It," right? And I use the word crumbling for a very specific reason, because it's not immediately obvious, right? When it's just, around the edges, as the water laps slowly eroding, that's a little bit different than having this dramatic, immediate, break or these very obvious cracks, right? I mean, when something is crumbling, you don't even necessarily see the big fissures yet. And so I do think deterrence is still crumbling, and not because we haven't made progress, but because we haven't made enough progress, and we've approached this as something to shore up what is already quite strong and expected to remain strong. And we focused more, I'll be honest, I think, in reassuring South Korea that deterrence is strong, and the South Koreans reassuring the United States as well, and reassuring themselves that deterrence is strong, rather than really taking a hard look at what could cause deterrence to fail and how the pressure is building up. And so there's several key variables that I want to highlight, and apologies since some of you have heard these before, but I think the last few years, I assess the last few years have shown these trends are actually getting worse One is the advancement of North Korea's nuclear capability, its nuclear delivery systems. At the strategic level, the threat it can pose to the continental United States. The operational and tactical level, the panoply of systems it has available, including those that are being essentially field tested in Ukraine by Russian forces, right? Those North Korean missiles, and then in particular. Another key element that I've emphasized in the past, and I think is very important, is the non-nuclear capabilities that North Korea has growing more precise, more diverse, giving them more options to conduct some kind of limited aggression. And so this actually reminds me, by the way, of something in the NDS, and a lot of it I actually think is quite good and makes a lot of sense. But I zero in on something that concerned me that maybe others wouldn't have noticed. As it referred to vigilance against North Korean invasion. Invasion is not what we should be worried about. The North Koreans are not going to invade South Korea. This is not going to be 1950 again if they attack. So if you're worried about deterring North Korea from trying again what they failed to do in 1950, we're fine, right? That's not what I'm talking about. You know, and those of us who've looked at these issues more in depth also understand the very limited provocations, probably vastly overblown in terms of their potential to spiral into war. What I'm worried about is those middle cases where Kim Jong-un authorizes something far beyond the scale of what's happened in the past, maybe beyond even the Chonan or Yongpyeong-do, and then that potentially leading either to a stinging defeat for the alliance or spiraling into an actual large-scale conflict. But again, the idea of North Korea launching a full-scale ground invasion, right? We've got that deterred. If that's our standard, then deterrence is fine, but that shouldn't be our standard. So that's why I'm concerned. But it reminds me of a basic adage that you have to view intentions and capabilities as two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm. And as North Korea's capabilities advance, the potential for then that to affect their calculus and therefore their intentions is a critical factor. And one of the things that I'll be interested to look for is it's been 5 years since North Korea laid out its 5-year plan for its defense milestones and its weapons programs. And during the course of that 5 years, I repeatedly warned about the potential for North Korea to make good on its plans to have multiple warheads for its long-range missiles, for its ICBMs. They said multiple warheads, but of course I would interpret that as being multiple reentry vehicles. And we haven't really seen that established yet. But my concern would be, here we are, it's the 5-year mark. You know, is Kim Jong-un going to make this rush to the finish, or when would we see that capability? Because that truly does create new challenges for missile defense, a new level of threat to the continental United States, these sorts of things. So I mean, I could go on, and I don't want to dominate the conversation, but the point is I do think as capabilities advance, they can affect intentions, and then also I do think we're being complacent on that potential for the middle case between a limited provocation that would be manageable but unfortunate, and a full-scale invasion, which of course is, I think, unrealistic and implausible as a threat.
Now, within those concerns, and I think back on your comment about what Kim Jong-un mentioned during a visit to China on that Pyongyang policy now in the conventional and the nuclear domain. If you look at the history of the program, and as North Korea really first kind of established its ability to make a nuclear device in that 2006 time period onward. And they proceeded to demonstrate long-range missile capabilities, particularly in that 2015, 2016 time period, 2016, 2017 time period. And then they moved on to hit the shorter range capabilities from 2019 onward to demonstrate an ability to hold at risk South Korea targets with nuclear devices. Now you've got this emphasis on the conventional side, enabled by, in large part, Russian support that helps modernize production facilities, improve and expand air, navy, air defense, ground capabilities. And so as you have a growing conventional threat, it brings credibility to the nuclear threat. A bunch of nuclear weapons that you can lob at the United States are entirely out of context as opposed to this mix. And I just wonder, Patrick, as you've looked at this evolution and you see where North Korea is going, are you surprised at this direction? What are your biggest concerns in terms of the North Korean threat and our preparedness to counter it?
Well, Sid, first of all, let me just say it's great to be with you and on this program and with these great colleagues. My concern about the North Korean threat is that the United States is now shifting all of the responsibility onto our South Korean allies so quickly that we may risk a problem with that handoff. E.J. Myung is so pragmatic as a politician. He wants to say yes to everything. He's obviously having trouble even with his National Assembly when it comes to pushing through his trade and investment deal that he's already made with President Trump. But when we ignore North Korea and just assume that this is the lesser work of our South Korean ally, and it's also their responsibility because it's their homeland, we open up that space that Markus is talking about, the potential for mischief, adventurism, problems that could arise that may undermine our capabilities. And even as we shift our focus to China, and that's a big question as well for our alliance with Korea, are we going to repurpose USFK to deal with China contingencies? Are we going to start doing exercises that are oriented toward our naval sea offshore and let anything that's on the ground basically be done by the South Koreans as we rush through and accelerate this wartime OPCON transition, perhaps? And while that's the right direction to go, South Korea is capable. Making the shift suddenly is where I think the problem arises. And I just worry about making sure we do this not on an artificial timetable, as Markus was suggesting, but we do it with understanding that we have an urgent security dilemma right now that's only getting worse. We don't want to open up any windows for miscalculation. And so I worry about the deterrence failing as well. In the first instance, I think it's going to be failing more likely on the gray zone side of things, and that's with China already. If we focus only on the high-end contingency on the Taiwan scenario, we sort of make the world safer for gray zone operations. And if we only focus on China, on the Korean Peninsula, we make the world safe for potential tensions to grow on the Korean Peninsula, even though, yes, it's not an invasion scenario. I'm not sure exactly what Kim Jong-un's objectives would be. What's his theory of victory if he takes the northern limit line and sort of nibbles away at that? Because then he would waken the region back up to the North Korean threat. I think he'd only do that hiding under the coattails of Chinese action elsewhere in the region. So it's a lesser, just mop that up. We can't care about that. Anyway, I do worry about making sure that despite the great people we already have at USFK and working on these issues, including Bridge Colby and others who understand strategy well, that we are asking so much of our Korean allies that they may have to seek urgent options to feel secure. So Markus is right. Maybe we spent too much time in the Biden administration era reassuring our South Korean allies, but at the same time, South Korea has very few options. How much more can you invest in the triple axis system? How much, what else do you want the South Koreans to do? But they're not going to feel reassured because they don't have nuclear weapons. And if we erode the extended nuclear deterrent, and that's the perception, they have to figure out a new option.
So to me, let me build on that last point. Of all the things that have been talked about, transfer of wartime OPCON, South Korea taking more responsibility for deterring the North Korea threat writ large, owning the ground game, the conventional dimension, there's been reassurances that the extended deterrence promise is always there. And if you take the logic that there's really probably not many scenarios on the peninsula that don't have a nuclear component to them almost immediately, there's no real change other than creative ways to try to urge South Korea to do more to spend more on its defense, to take its responsibility more seriously. The South Koreans have always been assumed to be the ones on the ground with the largest number of troops available, to be the main ones, both deterring North Korea and defending, while the U.S. has its assets coming in later. What really has changed?
Right.
What is there more to be concerned about than I just explained there?
Yeah, Sid, I think there's a deep seated misconception about how much responsibility South Korea already has taken for its own defense, as you're alluding. And I think, in part, there is this perception that the U.S. is playing a much larger role in the conventional deterrence day-to-day, the non-nuclear deterrence, not necessarily conventional, than it actually is, and that ROK forces are on the front lines, not U.S. forces. And so the number of times I've heard people in Washington, well, we need to get our forces off the DMZ and let the South Koreans handle the DMZ. I'm like, yeah, that's been the case for decades, right? I mean, you have some U.S. personnel in the JSA, battalion there, essentially a military police battalion, but we haven't had major ground forces on the DMZ. There were none even when I reported for duty in Korea for the first time over 2 decades ago. So a lot of it's based on misconception, and I think, Patrick, that's my concern, is if we go too far in the other direction, and we make it sound like the South Koreans aren't ready to take more responsibility for their own defense, then we underplay the progress that South Korea has already made. And so I've told people, and I think I might even have said it to Bridge himself before he took office, is that if you want the South Koreans to take more responsibility for their own defense, you're pushing on an open door. Right? But the issue of who is going to be the commander of Combined Forces Command in wartime is more complex than who's responsible, because at the end of the day, who is going to be able to say that the U.S. is fully committed to the defense of South Korea, and is going to be able to bring every aspect of capability, including nuclear, if there isn't a U.S. 4-star committed right there? Now, maybe under new construct, that U.S. 4-star could be the deputy commander, but at the end of the day, there's a difference between saying, hey, the ROK has primary responsibility, and saying, hey, what is the command and control relationship? What's going to be the role? So I think this gets vastly oversimplified, and my concern right now is if we have too many people pushing back on the idea that the ROK should take more responsibility, it unintentionally feeds the narrative that the ROK is somehow reluctant or incapable of taking more. And I think there's also a mismatch in reality, like Sid said. I think the South Koreans feel more responsible, and they have actually more capability that they're bringing in the non-nuclear space. And it's a question of how do we, though, maintain the confidence in South Korea and the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent, and how do we convince Pyongyang that, hey, the U.S. may be scaling back its level of responsibility in some way visibly, but at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent is at all compromised, right? That's the challenge.
I mean, so these are good points, but there's always another side. And,
Sure.
And so operationally, the other side is that the South Korean military in some ways is hollowed out from its previous warfighting experience decades ago. They've acquired lots of high technology, but I'm not sure that they're ready for the warfighting task that we're talking about. That's point one. The second point is I'm worried more about the decoupling of our military and civilian thinking. That is the difference between President Trump and the Trump administration. So we're talking about the Department of War is doing all the right things and giving all the reassurances, but the decoupling occurs potentially, especially in the perception of Kim Jong-un, when he has face-to-face meetings with President Trump. And he gets a peace declaration, whatever that means, kind of an empty, hollow peace declaration. And then it starts to really call into question the extended deterrence to some extent. And so that's more what I'm worried about. Markus is absolutely right. Of course, the South Koreans are capable of deterring and fighting the North Koreans and winning, but they do need to be serious about that activity.
Sure.
And this South Korean government needs to be serious about that, not just giving lip service to it.
Right.
And those are two different things.
Yeah, that's true.
And then we need to make sure that we do not unreassure South Korea in the process, right? So we can overdo the reassurance, but we can also underdo it.
So, Rachel, how do you think Kim Jong-un is looking at all this? On the one hand, a constant, steady stream of criticism of South Korea over the years has been their puppet status, their dependency on outside forces, their lack of autonomy, their lack of sovereignty, and the threat and the danger that this nuclear power the United States brings to the peninsula. Now we have a President Lee Jae-myung whose logic is that we need to be able to depend on ourselves. We appreciate the alliance with the United States, but anybody who thinks that the ROK is perpetually dependent on outside forces is a defeatist. Do you think Kim is being encouraged by this debate that now a road ahead in which the U.S. commitment to security of the ROK in the conventional and nuclear realms can be questioned? What insights can we gain by looking at what North Korea is saying or what it's thinking?
I certainly think that there is, and I share the concerns that Markus and Patrick have raised. I certainly think that there is some more room for miscalculation now from Kim Jong-un, especially with Russia sort of lurking in the background. Every time Kim Jong-un or some high-level meeting takes place between the Russians and the North Koreans, there seems to be some language about Russia looking at the Korean Peninsula situation, kind of indicating that they may get involved, right? And that's what the treaty says. I mean, the treaty leaves the door open for Russian involvement. So I think there's that sort of concern, and also I think one thing that I think is equally important is sort of North Korea's self-perception, right? Like how it stands now on the global stage. And I think Kim Jong-un in many ways has gained a lot of confidence, by taking part in the Russian war, and also the treaty with the Russians, having the Russians, sort of again in the background. North Korea's position on the sort of the transformation of the alliance, right? The modernization of the alliance, USFK strategic flexibility, is an interesting one because conventional wisdom would dictate that North Korea would be happy to see the USFK sort of being drawn to other, potentially other conflicts in the region, right? So distracted, so not fully focused on North Korea, on the Korean Peninsula. But based on some of the commentaries that they ran last summer, it looks like their calculus may be a little bit more complicated. So they're not all happy. They're actually talking about, the possibility of South Korea getting dragged into these regional conflicts in which the USFK is part of, and then somehow all of this creating more tensions and creating a more dangerous, an even more dangerous environment for North Korea. So sort of raising the alarm, right? So it would be, we have not seen any harsh commentary yet from North Korea on the joint fact sheets, the South Korea's quest for a nuclear submarine. But I think that's something we should be on the lookout for in the Ninth Party Congress.
So do you think secretly, in spite of their proclamations, particularly in 2024 on the two Koreas, and we're not interested in you, don't be interested in us, younger DPRK citizens don't have delusions about K-pop and other types of South Korean cultural products coming in. We are two Koreas and we are forever in a hostile state. Is that up for negotiation? Is that up for re-examination? Is the Ninth Party Congress possibly going to proclaim a willingness to engage the Lee Jae-myung administration because of the goodwill it showed through various steps, halting balloon launches, broadcasts, cutting down on illicit drone operations? Is that likely to give Kim an opportunity to try to reach out to South Korea?
I don't see that in the near future. And Kim Jong-un first announced his two Koreas policy in December 2023. Talked about it again in January 2024. And more than a year and a half later, in September 2025, at the Parliament, he gave another speech where a large portion of it was dedicated to, again, reiterating the legitimacy and the necessity of his two Koreas policy, which I thought was interesting. So, having said all of those things to the domestic public, those statements coming from the highest level, which is Kim Jong-un himself, I don't see how North Korea turns around and, just reaches out to South Korea, especially if, and this is just a possibility, that if Kim Jong-un somehow sees all of what's happening on the globe, the complexities, in the in the geopolitical space, the complexities in the region, the two Koreas policy. If somehow he's using all of those things to further elevate himself in the system, in the North Korean system, that's more of a reason for me, like why he would not have any reason to reach out to South Korea if that's something he can use to his advantage.
So I'll throw it open to all of you, maybe you want to own this question. There remains elements within the ROK, particularly progressive circles, that say the current standoff in relations with North Korea is the fault of the United States. And if only the U.S. would change its policy and engage North Korea, anything is possible. But short of that, North Korea is going to continue to ignore South Korea, and it's because of the state of U.S. DPRK relations. Is there anything to suggest that has any bearing that North Korea's calculus is all about, the United States and whether they're willing to talk or not, and that the future of inter-Korea relations is dependent on this? And if that's fundamentally flawed, what does that speak of in terms of, does ROK leadership know this and just simply continue to call on the U.S. to do something they know is impossible?
I think the South Korean government's also worried or they perceive North Korea's fear as more being infected by South Korean culture. That's the line I hear from the foreign minister and from other senior members of this government, of Minyoung. And I think that's legitimate. I think the progressive concern that you mentioned, that the United States is the obstacle, actually weaves well into the Trump diplomacy. And that's what President Lee Jae-myung is also hoping, right? We'll be the pacemaker, you, President Trump, be the peacemaker here. In April, for instance, have that meeting with Kim Jong-un, or later this year, have that meeting, break that ice, and when you reach some kind of deal, you cap and freeze the weapons, and you announce some kind of movement toward a declaration of end of war type of statement, then bring us into the equation, because we're ready to implement ideas that would tone down this sort of tension, and maybe get a seat back at the table.
I can't imagine a world in which any part of that is viable.
I don't think it's viable. I don't think it's the wise course. But you're asking me to think about what could happen,
Right.
And how South Korean government might be thinking of nudging the Trump administration.
I guess the challenge is, well, first of all, the fact that you have to nudge the Trump administration at all kind of would seem to portray a misunderstanding of the current standoff between the U.S. and DPRK. It's not because Donald Trump doesn't want to talk. It's because Kim Jong-un doesn't want to talk.
Right.
Second, the challenge of denuclearization is not whether you have it at the end of END, engage, normalization, denuclearize, or at the beginning, or that you dissect and divide denuclearization into, a halt, a cap, and an abandonment. We've done all that. These are all kind of nice talking points to generate positive reporting, to give some type of hope that you're thinking about it. And then now you have the unification ministry also wanting to demonstrate it's acting to build peace by seeking to build peace parks in the DMZ.
And announcing a special envoy.
Right, exactly. And as though there's a list of, 100 magical things. If you do them in the right sequence and the right timing, then Kim Jong-un will come down. But until then, we're acting unilaterally. So, nobody here really thinks that we're on the verge of some type of breakthrough with North Korea in the new year. Is that correct?
I wouldn't think so. I think there's another element to all this that's important to keep in mind, is that North Korea engaged in some pretty costly signaling about the permanent break with South Korea, right? If this had just been a change in some verbal party lines, the rhetoric, can be cheap talk and move very quickly. But, it's not irreversible, but the fact that even their logos they're using for their news no longer have the whole peninsula. They blow up the what is it, the Peace and Reunification Arch? I don't remember the translation. These sorts of things. Could they reintroduce some of those ideas? Sure, they could. But the point is that this seems to be a more lasting shift in their policy, and all the more reason why the bar would be extremely high. And I think it fits with this idea of the contagion from the South, and that a fundamental reconciliation with South Korea would be essentially a mortal wound for the Korean Workers' Party as it currently exists, and certainly for Kim Jong-un's leadership and for the Kim family's leadership. Right?
I mean, we always used to say North Korea does not paint itself into a corner. And when you own the truth, as it were, with the propaganda agitation department, and it's use of the narrative, it can do kind of Orwellian, shifts
Sure,
that
absolutely.
would be astounding. But yeah, there was something about what they did in breaking that inter-Korea peace that I just wonder what it would look like to rebuild it.
And I think the other thing to remember too is North Korea conducted 2 back-to-back constitutional revisions in October 2024 and again in January 2025, excuse me. And we don't know what they changed.
Right.
They have given us very brief mentions of some of the things that they've changed, but they did not mention when they were giving a readout of the constitutional revisions that they added a clause in the Constitution about South Korea being a completely hostile state. We found out from a Kim Jong-un's comment a few days later. So there is much we don't know about what may or may not have changed, right, in the
Right.
North Korean Constitution. And I think we may find out maybe soon after the Ninth Party Congress. There's a Supreme People's Assembly meeting just a few weeks or maybe even before that, after the Party Congress, like a follow-up. So we may find out.
But said just because North Korea has walked away from the grandfather's policy of reunification and this hostile state doctrine is now being enshrined in everything, including the Ninth Party Congress, undoubtedly, doesn't mean they couldn't have foreign ministry to foreign ministry talks. If especially it's coming in the aftermath of some progress, if you will, whatever that means, in terms of U.S. North Korean diplomacy. And from North Korea's perspective, it could be legitimacy. They don't want contagion. They want legitimacy on the world stage. They want to be a permanent nuclear weapon state. They want security from Moscow and Beijing. And if they can get more sanctions relief, they're busting all the sanctions now, but if they can get further relief, that would be good. And if South Korea is part of the price they pay for that to just keep them as a weaker alliance and slow down even South Korean armament, maybe there's some diplomatic advantage to that.
So that would kind of be a best case scenario. The worst case scenario being one of North Korea having made a decision at some point, it will engage in some type of revisionist actions against South Korea that will have a legal justification, will have a moral justification, a diplomatic justification, and will become increasingly possible as the conventional force improvements that they've articulated tend to enable those types of actions.
And I think that's probably more likely.
So where are you most worried about then?
Well, let's talk about the Russia-North Korea relationship. This is a long-term defense partnership that's going to grow over time, most likely. Now, it is dependent on Putin to some extent, so we don't know what happens eventually when Russian leadership changes. But this conventional rebuilding in South Korea, North Korea is no mistake, right? It's related very much to providing the munitions and the armament for Russia's war against Ukraine. The fact that Kim Jong-un just unveiled these new statues that are going to be part of this great new memorial, he is a great leader in his mind, right? And in his propaganda state, in the impossible state of North Korea, he has got fallen soldiers who have fallen for the great cause of what? We're not sure exactly what, but what's coming is Russian money, Russian technology, and because the Russians don't want to give up direct nuclear technology, it's mostly conventional and indirect, although it could have implications for missiles and other technologies, submarine propulsion and other things too.
Right, and I do think the delivery systems are really key. The missiles that we're talking about, it's very clear from the open information that these are essentially nuclear-capable systems, dual-use missiles that are being refined through their employment against Ukraine by the Russians.
Absolutely, and that refinement is precision and it's all ranges, and that provides you the basis for future conflict.
So what's the scenario? What's the objective? What's the scope of the action? What would it look like?
Well, what's the timeline on when does it happen?
All right. Well, so I can give you three, right? Okay. So and these all have been talked about before, but the one that I've written about and talked about for the longest was some sort of escalation in the UOC, the West Sea, as they call it in Korea, as you know, and directed not necessarily at even seizing the islands, but neutralizing them militarily, inflicting a sharp military defeat on South Korea, and then creating a situation where the United States is operationally and strategically unable to significantly support South Korea, right? I'm not saying that this would work, but this would be the theory of victory, and like I said, there's plenty of writing I've done on this already. You can refer
Justified
to.
by illegal use of waters. that
Sure,
really North
and
Korea-
claiming there's some sort of military threat emanating from the Northwest Islands and these sorts of things, that there's offensive weapons base there. They can generate all sorts of pretexts, right? And the idea is North Korea can then rely in that sort of scenario on two things to help prevent the ROK and the U.S. from effectively responding at sort of the more strategic level. One is nuclear deterrence, to be able to use nuclear coercion to threaten if you counterattack significantly, then we will use nuclear weapons. But also, this is right on China's doorstep, and already China's engaging in these incursions into South Korea's EEZ and planting these buoys, and so the moment is right there to try and bring in China. But those are the strategic level issues. At the operational level, the more accurate North Korean missiles become, the more drones they have, then the more likely it is they're going to be able to achieve localized military superiority. And especially when you look at the Hwanghae Peninsula, we're talking about literally thousands of square kilometers of mountains that you can honeycomb with underground facilities that you can operate from. And then you've got these tiny little islands that are isolated. They're separated from Seoul. And so, as in one of my pieces, I say, in quite clearly, if you think about it as a metaphor, the North Koreans that are shooting against those islands are shooting fish in a barrel, whereas a counterattack would be playing whack-a-mole, trying to track those things down.
Shoot in the scoot.
Right, and so then this creates a situation where it's impossible to achieve a clear military victory if you're South Korea and the United States without undertaking what the political leadership would be considered unacceptable risk,
Right.
and without employing a disproportionate amount of combat power. And so it creates this essentially insoluble dilemma, and that could be an intermediate step, as I've written before, to basically neutralizing the alliance by convincing the people of South Korea it's just not worth it, right?
And it pivots everybody to negotiations on Pyongyang's terms.
Of course, yes,
you know.
yeah. So that's one scenario.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the other two, real quick, are North Korea sees a pretext of claiming that South Korea is developing its own nuclear weapons, and launches it. I don't know what the Korean translation for Midnight Hammer would be off the top of my head, but something like that. And I wrote about that actually when you published the UNCLOS NIE. That was one of the scenarios. Yeah. And then another one is there's a U.S.-China conflict in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, in the Ryukyu somewhere. There's a military clash that escalates, and then North Korea sees, either for opportunistic reasons or even for reactive reasons, that it needs to escalate. Those are just three off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, the Midnight Hammer, the strike on sort of decapitating or preempting the Iranian nuclear capabilities is apropos, because right now we have the so-called armada near the Persian Gulf. When you have three carrier battle groups, not just one, strike groups in Asia, you just call it three carrier strike groups doing their presence missions. But when you have it off Iran, suddenly it's an armada. And that's because we've done...
He used Armada in 2017. He did.
All right.
Good memory.
But that's because, though, it was a real military operation, though, in Iran, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
In Asia, we still lack credibility. Who's going to be the first to strike? But this is maybe now giving credit to the Trump administration on NSS and the National Defense Strategy to highlight the need for strategic stability and the need to focus on the big powers and make sure that you've got some stability with China without being naive about it, clear-eyed, as they say, because North Korea will be more likely to do this if they think they can get away with it, if there are other things going on in the region. And those become really possible if the United States is more retrenched, if China is more engaged militarily in the region or engaged in action, and they have Russian support as well. That's a very dangerous future. But there are answers to it. I mean, we must not let that develop. We must work on our military, our industrial capability, our alliances, our diplomacy. And if we do all of those things and have a strong economy and a strong industrial capability, we will have a lot of say still. We will have a lot of influence on this. And it's good to have allies like Korea and Japan, because they're really important for making it everybody clear that we have capability, we can work together, we can pull these things off together. And I'm very optimistic we can do these things, and South Koreans can fight and defeat the North Koreans. I'm just worried about letting gaps grow in our capabilities as we shift our responsibilities onto our allies.
Can I add just 2 points? So we're talking about like potential conflict scenarios. I think two things that we should look out for are the domestic situation in North Korea. I don't see any signs of instability in North Korea at the moment, but I think longer term, or if there is some kind of a leadership transition in North Korea, I think leadership transition periods have always been accompanied by, provocations from North Korea, right?
I thought you were
From
going to
Kim
say
Il-sung to Kim
speculative
Jong-un.
analysis from Washington.
That too.
But something to watch out for, because there's a lot of talk about why Kim Joo-ae is out there and about as she is, or as she has been since November 2022. I'm not going to make any predictions about whether she is the successor or not, but if there is some kind of a leadership transition down the road, domestic stability, and secondly, the China piece of this whole thing. I think DPRK-China relations will be interesting to watch. I know that there's been a lot of talk about the recovery of, trade statistics between the two countries, a lot more increased business activity between the two countries since Kim's summit with Xi Jinping in September 2025. But I think at the Kim level, though, if you track North Korean media rhetoric, it's the relationship, at least from Kim's point of view, is lukewarm. And I would be very curious to see how far that relationship goes or can go without that, dedication from Kim Jong-un's part, because that's the missing piece here in DPRK Russia from North Korea's point of view when we look at China.
I would have to say that it's great you brought up China. We don't have enough time to really talk about China's role in all this, but I look, particularly thinking back my own experience when I was special envoy, involved with a lot of diplomacy with China at that time, back in the 2013, 2014, 2015 time period. And then as we watched their kind of inevitable cooperation with us in response to the 2016 and 17 missile launches, probably largely driven to discourage us from taking more aggressive action by being cooperative in the Security Council. But since then, you've never sensed a desire of either leader to make many concessions in the name of improved PRC-DPRK relations. It's lukewarm. It has periods where they're able to cover it up and pretend to get along. And then there's times when it's seldom as visibly bad, but it's not, something's not clicking there. So China continues to be kind of limited in its influence, and and that cuts both ways. If we're hoping that we have a partner in China that can help restrain North Korea's behavior, that's probably a bit naive. But that said, well, that's about all we have time for today. Thank you. Thanks to our three guests. We covered a lot of topics in a way that I hope was meaningful to all of you, and certainly to our audience out there. And we look forward to our next session of The Impossible State.